Thanks for joining me once again for the latest in our series of videos exploring money. In the last video, we started considering the subject of interest. To put the question in the simplest possible terms, why does the fact that a person has managed to get hold of a sum of money entitle that person to receive even more money without expending any additional effort? And what effect does that fact have on the fabric of our economy and our society? There's not a clear, universally agreed upon theory of interest. So the best we can do is familiarize ourselves with the different perspectives that people have proposed over the years. Silvio Gesell offers a clear, logical explanation for the existence of interest, as well as a compelling investigation of the many ways in which interest impacts our lives. To give you a sense of where we're heading with all of this, Gesell attributes many, if not most, of the big picture problems which have plagued economic systems throughout history, such as poverty, wealth inequality, and recurring economic crises, to the existence of interest. Gesell essentially views interest as a cancer of the economic organism, an unintended consequence of a flawed form of money, and his proposals were aimed at fixing the problem. He believed that replacing our existing form of money with a more rationally designed system would eliminate this defect from the economy, thereby enabling wealth, energy, and information to circulate in a more natural, healthy manner. One of the most insidious aspects of interest is that many of its effects are hidden. While people may sense that there's a problem, they often believe that as long as they don't borrow or lend money, interest doesn't affect them. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Interest touches all of our lives in countless ways. It affects the demand for labor and the level of wages. It affects the prices of the things we buy. It affects the availability of housing. It affects the taxes we pay. It even affects the balance of power between nations. It's not an exaggeration to say that interest affects virtually every economic transaction that is intermediated by money. In future videos, we'll look at all the hidden ways in which interest impacts our lives. But first, we need to familiarize ourselves with how people have thought about this subject throughout history. For those who are locked into a capital versus labor mindset for diagnosing our economic problems, Gesell offers a totally different framework for analyzing the situation. Whereas the vast majority of economic debate for the past century and a half has been between defenders of the capitalist status quo and those who advocate replacing the free market system with various forms of centralized control, Gesell offers a simpler, clearer, and more logical perspective on what's wrong with our economic system and what we can do to generate better outcomes. He argued that the capital versus labor debate is essentially a false framework. Neither the capitalists nor the proponents of central planning have the answers we need because both of them ignore the central problem of money and interest. Before delving into the particulars, we need to clear up some definitions first. The term interest, as it's commonly used, actually consists of three distinct components, each of which operates according to different principles. A typical interest rate, which would be used to calculate payments on a mortgage or a car loan, is actually the sum of these three components. The first component is what's referred to as a risk premium. This is a payment to the provider of a loan to compensate for the possibility that the loan won't be repaid. The risk premium is different, at least in theory, for every loan, since no two borrowers are the same. Thus, the risk of default is different for every loan. The second component of interest is an adjustment for changes in the purchasing power of money, otherwise known as inflation or deflation. If I loan you $100 for 1 year without interest, and we experience inflation during that period, let's say the purchasing power of money decreases by 5%, the $100 you pay me back in a year will have less purchasing power than the money I originally loaned you. Thus, without interest, I would lose money in real terms. And the third component is what's often referred to as risk-free interest. This is the power of money to grow after accounting for risk and for changes in the purchasing power of money. Economists call this component pure interest. When calculating the rate for a real-world financial obligation like a mortgage, the lender will typically use a base interest rate, which is meant to approximate pure interest, and will then add an amount to compensate for the risk premium and another amount to protect against changes in the purchasing power of money. In reality, it's unfortunate that we use one word to refer to these three components because they're actually completely different things. It would have been better if we had used three different words for each of the components. Doing so would eliminate an enormous amount of confusion surrounding the subject of interest. So, to be clear, as we move forward with our discussion of Silvio Gesell's analysis of interest, we are only talking about the third component, so-called pure interest. Gesell has no objection to the other two components of what is typically described as interest. He agrees that lenders should be compensated both for the risk of non-payment as well as for variations in the purchasing power of money. He only objects to the element of interest which represents a risk-free, effort-free profit that accrues to the holders of money. So please keep in mind that as we proceed with this discussion, when we use the word interest, we're using it in a more specific, narrower sense than how the word is used in everyday language. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's survey some of the perspectives on interest which have been offered throughout history so we can compare them with Gesell's theory and decide what makes the most sense. For being such an important subject, most people have probably never given the phenomenon of interest a second thought. It's simply something that has always been there, like gravity. But interest is not a law of nature. It's not a natural or inevitably occurring phenomenon. It's a man-made creation, even if we didn't create it intentionally. It's a logical and inevitable consequence of adopting a hoardable form of money as our medium of exchange. A variety of rationales have been offered for why money earns interest. Some of these explanations are based on the fertility of nature. Others are based on a so-called time preference. In other words, the notion that it's better to have things in the present than to have them in the future. It's too big and complicated a subject to be dealt with in one video, so today we're going to start by looking at how interest was thought about in the ancient world. In future videos, we'll examine some more modern perspectives. So for starters, it's interesting to note that all three of the world's major religions have imposed prohibitions against charging interest. In the Old Testament, Jews are forbidden to charge interest to fellow Jews, but they're allowed to charge interest to non-Jews. Christianity originally prohibited the charging of interest in general, although those prohibitions have been removed over the years. Islam is the only one of the three religions which maintains the prohibition of interest up to the present day. Scholars from all three religions have explored the differences between the two primary forms of financial investment, equity and debt. An equity investor is one who purchases an ownership stake in a business and participates in both its profits and its losses. A debt investor, on the other hand, provides money in exchange for a financial obligation and expects to be paid regardless of the performance of the business. A bondholder gets paid even when a company loses money, whereas a stockholder only gets paid when the company makes a profit. This is an important distinction, and there seems to be agreement among the religions that the former type of investment is legitimate and natural, while the latter is illegitimate and sinful. Aristotle also examined the inherent conflict at the heart of money. He distinguished between different types of exchange and considered some of them natural and beneficial and others unnatural and harmful. Enabling the exchange of goods and services was, in Aristotle's view, the original purpose of money and its sole legitimate function. He saw the potential for money to be misused. Aristotle defined the term usury differently from how we use that word today, and used it to refer to both the buying and selling of products for profit, as well as lending money for interest. The reason why he lumped these two activities together is because they both involve the taking of profits without the creation of new economic wealth. Therefore, from his perspective, both were effectively forms of theft. We should note that Aristotle's view is consistent with the Bible and the Quran, both of which often lump together the taking of unnatural profits and lending for interest. Aristotle considered money to be barren, and therefore believed it was immoral and unnatural to charge for its use. Today, we've largely lost sight of this fact. We operate under the illusion that money, quote unquote, earns interest and therefore has productive power. But this is an illusion. Anyone who really thinks about it should be able to see that money by itself has no productive power. That belongs exclusively to real goods and services. Thinking of money as something with productive power is an irrational habit of thought which is caused by the fact that we've designed a form of money which combines two functions, medium of exchange and store of value, which are fundamentally incompatible. It's also worthwhile to highlight a key distinction that Aristotle made in terms of the growth dynamics of money when employed to facilitate natural economic production and when used unnaturally for financial manipulation. Natural production of real goods and services follows physical laws, and its growth is limited by the fact that we live on a planet with finite resources. Whereas financial growth is subject to no inherent limits. Financial processes can grow indefinitely and exponentially, which is obviously at odds with an environment in which there are finite resources. A common way to illustrate this difference is the story of Joseph's penny. If Joseph had invested 1 gold penny at the time of Jesus' birth at 5% compound interest, today that investment would have grown to a solid gold sphere 150 million times bigger than Earth. This is an illustration of the tendency of people to underestimate the importance and impact of interest. While people might grasp the moral argument that interest is inherently unjust, they fail to appreciate the magnitude of its significance. After all, what difference does a few percent make? Well, as this anecdote shows, it makes all the difference in the world. An economy built on the foundation of hoardable currency and its consequence, interest, is inevitably prone to collapse. Thinking about it this way allows us to understand the idea, shared by both Aristotle and Silvio Gesell, that interest is a cancer in the social organism. Its growth follows different laws than those which govern the production of real goods and services, and over time it overwhelms everything. This is not a moral judgment, it's just simple math. In the interest of time, we're going to pause the discussion at this point. In the next video, we'll explore some more modern perspectives on interest, and then we'll get into Gesell's analysis of its causes and consequences. Thanks for watching.